Robbie, what's on your radar?
So the New York Times published an unexpected but terrific, frankly, editorial on Friday that takes note of America's free speech problem and points to both right-wing legislation and cancel culture enforced by an uncompromising strain of progressivism as culprits. For all the tolerance and enlightenment that modern society claims, Americans are losing hold of a fundamental right as citizens of a free country, the right to speak their minds and voice their opinions in public without fear of being shamed or shunned, wrote the Times. The editorial includes a predictable and mostly well-deserved condemnation of conservative attempts to legislate away uncomfortable discussions about sex and race in schools, but it stands out for directly attacking the left's censorship impulse. Quote, many on the left refuse to acknowledge that cancel culture exists at all, believing that those who complain about it are offering cover for bigots to peddle hate speech, wrote the Times. Many on the right, for all their braying about cancel culture, have embraced an even more extreme version of censoriousness as a bulwark against a rapidly changing society with laws that would ban books, stifle teachers, and discourage open discussion in classrooms. So let me just read you two more key paragraphs from this editorial, which, as I said, was really good. The full-throated defense of free speech was once a liberal idea. Many of the legal victories that expanded the realm of permissible speech in the United States came in defense of liberal speakers against the power of the government. A ruling that students couldn't be forced to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. A ruling protecting the rights of students to demonstrate against the Vietnam War. A ruling allowing the burning of the American flag. And yet, many progressives appear to have lost faith in that principle. This was a source of great frustration for one of those who responded to our poll, Emily Leonard, a 93-year-old from Hartford, Connecticut, who described herself as a liberal, but she said she was alarmed about reports of speakers getting shouted down on college campuses. We need to hear what people think, even though we disagree with them. It is the basis of our democracy, and it's absolutely essential to a continuing democracy, Ms. Leonard said. Liberals as I am, a little to the left of Lenin, I think these kids and this whole cancel culture and so-called woke is doing us so much harm. They're undermining the Constitution. That's what it comes down to. So look, in truth, the editorial reads like it could have been written by, well, me. In fact, Rolling Stone editor Noah Schachman cited it as evidence that I now own the New York Times editorial board. Alas, if only that were true. How much fun could I have? In fact, the opinion pages of the Times, they host a diversity of viewpoints, a variety. Of course they do. Just last week, the paper published a guest essay by Emma Camp, a University of Virginia student, about the culture of self-censorship she encountered on campus. Camp's piece generated a massive backlash on social media from the very sort of cancel culture-denying liberals the Times is criticizing in its editorial. As Politico's John Harris put it, the torrent of mockery that greeted her on Twitter made the case about the hazards of saying something unpopular more persuasively than she could have imagined. We had Camp on Rising the week before last, so go and check that out if you missed it. Now, as with Camp's op-ed, the Times editorial has caused some liberals' heads to explode. Here's an incomplete sampling. Liberal writer Adam Davidson, quote, if I still worked at the New York Times, I would seriously think about quitting today. Liberal professor Jeff Jarvis, this is appalling. The both sidism of the New York Times comes out in full force from its editorial board as it equates the left criticizing hate and the right burning books. Pure moral panic. Liberal Daily Beast columnist Wajahat Ali retweet if you want the New York Times to add more columnists who write about the rise of fascism instead of adding more who always complain about cancel culture. Progressive historian Kevin Cruz, if the New York Times doesn't want people being shamed or shunned for bad opinions, they can help by no longer running columns by Dowd, Brooks, and Stevens. Those latter two are conservative writers, I guess Cruz's version of an improved New York Times. It's one that includes fewer perspectives. How surprising. So liberals, at least on Twitter, may have actually been angrier about the editorial than Camp's op-ed. An op-ed reflects only the views of the writer, whereas a staff editorial speaks with the authority of the entire paper. Of course, there's nothing particularly odd about the New York Times taking the ideological position that free speech is of vital importance to American society and democracy, that the legal protections of the First Amendment and a broader culture of social tolerance are both desirable norms, and that social progress is generally well served by maximally permitting free and open discourse. In fact, this was the default position of most liberal-minded writers, thinkers, and publications until recently. Self-described progressives who react with apoplectic fury every time the New York Times counsels against total abandonment of Enlightenment principles, they're actually the odd ones out. By now, it should be impossible to ignore the ill effects of free speech hostility. What appeared to begin on elite college campuses has spread to broader society and is agitating for a world where the act of dissenting from progressive orthodoxy is treated as violence, and thus can be met with force. Indeed, college campuses continue to provide some of the most palpable examples of this phenomenon. Earlier this month, Yale Law School students shouted down a conservative speaker and a liberal one, as well as the school's own officials, in order to prevent a discussion about a recent Supreme Court case. I talked about it on my radar a few days ago, but for a refresher, here's the video footage.
Well, as you know, Yale has a policy of freedom of speech. And that
We told you, Mother Miller, this is what it would be. Will those trans kids grow up?
you guys,
This is
I
free
look
speech.
forward to hearing
This
from
is
you
free
when we
speech.
get to question and answer.
Free speech is
Why
not
are you allowed
allowed
to
to be.
talk here and
No,
allowed
you're
to protest?
disrupting the free speech.
We're not. You're
David Latt, an attorney, legal commentator, and Yale graduate, described the incident as actually much worse than what we see in the video. According to Latt, even classes in different parts of the building on different floors were actually disrupted by the protesters on account of how loud they were. All because a social conservative dared to try to speak on campus. So look, this has gone way too far. The student activist philosophy is by now familiar to everyone who has paid attention to higher education for the past decade. Speech that perturbs progressives on their allies is illegitimate and should be prevented. This philosophy must be countered by everyone who claims to hold liberal values. I, for one, am relieved to know that the Gray Lady still has some fight left in her. So did you see this editorial on Friday and the reaction on Twitter?
I saw the reaction on Twitter, and the only reason I finally read it is because I saw that you were doing your
Good. How did you feel about it?
radar on this. Yeah, it's a good piece. I would have tweaked the. I felt like it was a little overly unnecessarily broad in their first sentence, where they said people are sad that they've lost their free speech rights to speak in public without ever being shamed. It's like nobody thinks that is what the standard should be. Like, you shouldn't just be throwing around the N-word and not be shamed about it.
Right.
For instance, like 99.99% of people in surveys would agree with that point. So everybody agrees that there's some shaming is necessary to have a civilization. Like that's how we make societies. The question is, where is that line? And the reason I didn't read the editorial, despite all of the Twitter outrage about it, is because it doesn't feel like anybody is even approaching this question and asking where that line ought to be, or really everybody's just kind of going back and forth with talking points on these. Like, maybe if we just split out the shouting down people in classrooms and at events, maybe they could talk about that. Because people say, well, it's my right to shame you. Okay, you obviously didn't like when the New York Times responded to you. You don't like being shamed for your shame, but it's their right to shame you for your shame. So what if we just split out? Okay, how about we say it's not illegal to just have the entire audience just screaming at somebody the entire time, but let's all agree that it's not cool.
Yeah.
Can we start there?
Well, it does. In that instance, it does not violate the law. It violates the campus's policies, the perfectly reasonable policies that, like, look, other people want to listen to the speaker, and you're going to come in and just make that impossible. Like, it's a university. People pay how much ever money they pay to go to Yale, this very privileged educational experience, so they can hear interesting people speak. And your philosophy is, no.
I'm just going to yell.
We're going to prevent that.
And so
really dumb.
Separating that out, again, to the political question, their polling that they included in that was very interesting.
Yeah.
And that Democrats should pay attention to. And it found that Democrats actually are on the opposite side of Democrats. In other words, Democratic voters are on the opposite side of Democratic leaders or kind of Democratic elites on this question. Like, they do believe that cancel culture is a real thing. They have held their tongue and not said something, not asked some good faith question that they had because they were afraid of getting shamed, and particularly pronounced among women, which is very interesting in that poll. And it's going to become an increasing political problem. It already is a problem, but it'll become an increasingly one, because every time that one of these a group of kids goes and shouts somebody down, everybody there is going to be filming it and posting it, and then Republicans are going to make sure that everybody sees it and says, like, this is the Democratic Party, even though probably most of them think the Democratic Party's a bunch of corporate sellouts. But they're lumped in with the Democratic Party, and it's going to drag them down. It's going to be, because people don't feel like the government is actually doing much to improve their lives. So therefore, they're going to vote on things like, owning their enemies or ways that they can just be less annoyed.
Yeah. They've lost the framing of these kinds of issues, right? Republicans have won.
Right.
People don't like cancel culture. They don't like
and they associate it with Democrats.
And they associate with Democrats.
Fair or not?
Yeah.
That's what the world is now.
Yeah.
So, but also, do you have to go to an event and just shout the whole time?
They always
why?
do. They always do.
It's not helping.
Not helping.
It's not helping your cause.
Not helping. But anyway, I'm looking forward to your radar coming up next.